Rude millionaire, catches black-maid dancing with his deaf triplets. What they did next in the kitchen shocked him. The silence in Jonathan Reed's Greenwich mansion wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, broken only by the soft thud of tiny feet that would never hear their own footsteps, and the echo of a man who had forgotten how to listen with his heart. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The marble floors of Reed Industries' Manhattan headquarters reflected nothing but cold efficiency, much like the man who owned them. Jonathan Reed stood at his corner office window 40 stories above the bustling streets, watching the ant-like figures below navigate their insignificant lives. At 42, he had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. His reflection stared back, sharp jawline, prematurely silver hair that made him look distinguished rather than tired, and eyes that had forgotten how to smile. The city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom, but conquest felt hollow when there was no one left to celebrate with. "Mr. Reed." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The new domestic staff member is arriving at the Greenwich house this afternoon." Jonathan didn't turn from the window. "Fine. Should I brief her on the children's special requirements?" The question hung in the air like smoke. His 3-year-old triplets, Emma, Ethan, and Ellie, were born deaf into a world that had already taken too much. He pressed his palm against the cool glass. "Mrs. Patterson will handle it." But Mrs. Patterson had quit last week, the 4th nanny in 6 months. They all quit eventually, overwhelmed by children who communicated in ways the hearing world found uncomfortable, challenging, different. What do you think? Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own life? Share your thoughts below. 50 miles away in Greenwich, Zara Williams stepped out of the rideshare car and gazed up at the Reed estate. The colonial mansion rose before her like something from a movie. White columns, manicured lawns, windows that gleamed like diamonds in the afternoon sun. She had cleaned houses in Martha's Vineyard, worked estates in the Hamptons, but this felt different. Bigger. More isolated. At 28, Zara carried herself with quiet dignity that spoke of strength earned, not inherited. Her grandmother's cross caught the light at her throat, a reminder that grace could be found anywhere, even in the pristine emptiness of other people's dreams. She hefted her single suitcase, containing everything she owned, and approached the front door. The brass knocker was heavier than it looked, its sound echoing through what felt like a mausoleum. Footsteps approached, but slowly, as if whoever was coming dreaded the arrival. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired shoulders. "You must be Zara." "I'm Mrs. Patterson." "Well, I was Mrs. Patterson. I'm just staying until you're settled." Something in the older woman's voice carried warning, sadness, resignation. "The children?" Zara asked. "There." Mrs. Patterson paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're special, beautiful souls. But Mr. Reed, he—" She trailed off, stepping aside to let Zara enter. The foyer stretched before them, all marble and crystal, but Zara noticed what others might miss. Small fingerprints on the walls at child height, a forgotten toy car tucked behind an ornate vase, signs of life trying to exist in a museum. Where are they now? Nap time. But they don't sleep much. They feel everything. Vibrations, changes in air pressure, emotions. They know when someone new comes. As if summoned by her words, a small face appeared at the top of the grand staircase. A little girl with dark curls and eyes that seemed older than her 3 years. She watched them with the intensity of someone who had learned to read the world through sight and sensation rather than sound. Zara raised her hand in a gentle wave. The child ducked back, but not before Zara caught something else. Loneliness that mirrored her own. "That's Emma," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "She's the protector of the three. Always watching, always worried." Two more faces appeared, a boy with his father's sharp features and another girl with an impish smile that suggested mischief lived here despite everything. Ethan and Ellie, Zara guessed. "They haven't had consistency," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Their mother. She died in childbirth. Complications." Mr. Reed blamed himself, then blamed everyone else. The children were born premature, and the medications, well, they saved their lives but took their hearing. The weight of tragedy settled around them like dust. Zara understood now why the house felt like a tomb. Grief had a way of stopping time, freezing families in the moment everything changed. "He loves them," Mrs. Patterson continued, "but he doesn't know how to show it anymore. Doesn't know how to connect with children who experience the world differently. So he provides everything except himself." Footsteps thundered down the stairs. 3 pairs of small feet that moved with the particular rhythm of children who navigated by vibration rather than sound. They stopped at the bottom, studying Zara with identical expressions of cautious curiosity. Emma stepped forward first, always the brave one, and pointed to herself, then to her siblings, then to Zara with a questioning look. Zara knelt to their level, understanding instinctively that this was a test, a moment that would define everything that came after. She pointed to herself and mouthed Zara clearly, then pointed to each of them with raised eyebrows. Emma's face lit up. She pointed to herself, Emma, then to the boy, Ethan, then to the other girl, Ellie. Each name was accompanied by a simple sign, hands moving in patterns that spoke louder than voices ever could. "You know sign language?" Mrs. Patterson asked, surprised. "A little," Zara admitted. "I had a deaf neighbor growing up. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me the basics." But it was more than basics that made her kneel there, maintaining eye contact with 3 children who had learned that most adults either stared too much or looked away entirely. It was recognition, the understanding that came from being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Emma stepped closer and, with the boldness of a child who had decided to trust, placed her small hand on Zara's cheek. The touch was feather-light but somehow profound, as if she were reading something written in Zara's heart. Then Emma smiled, a real smile, perhaps the first in this house for months, and Zara felt something shift in the marble-cold air. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes. "Well," she said softly, "that's the first time they've approached a new caregiver without hiding." Ethan tugged on Zara's sleeve and pointed toward what she assumed was the kitchen, then patted his stomach with an exaggerated expression of hunger that needed no translation. "They eat dinner at 5, Mrs. Patterson said. Mr. Reed usually works late, eats in his study. He finds mealtimes difficult." Zara stood, her mind already working. Difficult because sitting around a table meant acknowledging the silence that wasn't really silence, meant facing the communication gap that felt impossible to bridge. "What if," she said quietly, "we changed that?" As Mrs. Patterson gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Zara, be patient with him. He's not cruel, just broken. And these children, they need." She gestured helplessly. "They need their father," Zara finished. "Yes. But more than that, they need him to need them back." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Zara alone with 3 small souls who had learned to speak in ways the world often ignored. She looked around the pristine foyer, imagining it filled with laughter that couldn't be heard but could certainly be felt. Emma tugged on her hand, leading her toward the kitchen. Ethan and Ellie followed, their bare feet silent on marble that had forgotten the sound of joy. As they walked, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced in the foster homes: the temporary jobs, the constant moving, the possibility of home. Not a place, but a feeling. Not perfection, but belonging. The kitchen awaited, and with it, the beginning of everything. The kitchen existed in a strange temporal bubble. 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt suspended between what was and what could be. Jonathan had returned from Manhattan earlier than usual, his conscience nagging him about the new hire he'd barely acknowledged. The house felt different somehow, less tomb-like, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He loosened his Italian silk tie as he approached the kitchen, expecting the usual scene: children eating in mechanical silence while some overwhelmed caregiver counted minutes until bedtime. Instead, he heard something that stopped him cold. Music. Not just any music, but Stevie Wonder's "Isn't She Lovely" flowing from the kitchen speakers, and beneath it, laughter. Not the polite, careful sounds adults make around deaf children, but genuine, uninhibited joy that seemed to pulse through the very walls. Jonathan pressed himself against the doorframe, hidden from view, and witnessed something that would haunt and heal him in equal measure. Zara stood in the center of his pristine kitchen, her shoes kicked off, moving to the rhythm with his 3 children. But this wasn't ordinary dancing. She had placed her hands on the kitchen island's marble surface, and the children had their small palms pressed against it too, feeling the vibrations travel through the stone. Her body moved with the bass line, creating visual rhythm they could follow, while her face carried every note of the melody. Emma, his serious, worried Emma, was giggling, actually giggling, as she mimicked Zara's movements. Ethan spun in circles, his arms outstretched, face tilted toward the ceiling in pure abandon. Ellie clapped her hands not to the beat she couldn't hear, but to the rhythm she felt in her chest, her whole body alive with motion. But it was Zara who stopped Jonathan's breath entirely. She moved like joy had taken human form, her natural grace elevated by the pure love radiating from her every gesture. When she dipped low to meet Emma's eyes, when she lifted Ellie into a gentle spin, when she ruffled Ethan's hair as he attempted his own version of a moonwalk, every movement spoke a language Jonathan had forgotten existed: the language of connection. She was signing as she danced, her hands telling stories in the air while her body kept time. The children watched, mesmerized, learning that communication could be beautiful, that their way of experiencing the world wasn't a limitation but a different kind of magic. Like this, Zara signed and spoke simultaneously, showing them how to feel the bass drum through their feet, how the guitar's vibration traveled up through the floor, how music lived in more than sound. Music isn't just what you hear, it's what you feel, what you see, what makes your heart want to move. Emma attempted to copy a complex hand movement, stumbled, then burst into laughter at her own mistake. When had his daughter last laughed at herself instead of withdrawing in perfectionist frustration? Ethan grabbed a wooden spoon and began drumming on a pot, creating his own rhythm. The metallic clangs should have been jarring, but somehow they wove into the song's fabric, adding texture that made the whole experience richer. Ellie, his youngest by mere minutes but always the most emotionally intuitive, pressed both hands against Zara's hip, feeling the movement, learning to translate motion into meaning. And Zara danced like this was the most natural thing in the world, like teaching deaf children to feel music was exactly what Tuesday evenings were designed for. Jonathan's chest tightened, but not with his familiar grief. This was different, sharper, more dangerous. This was the ache of seeing what he'd been missing, of recognizing the father he might have been if fear hadn't frozen him solid. When had he last touched his children with such easy affection? When had he last made them laugh? When had he last seen them as anything other than beautiful reminders of everything that had gone wrong? Tell us in the comments. What's a moment when someone showed you a completely different way of seeing the world? The song shifted to a slower tempo, and Zara's movements gentled accordingly. She gathered the children close, showing them how to feel the melody's sadness and hope intertwined. Her voice, when she sang along, was honey over gravel, untrained but authentic, carrying emotions that polished perfection could never touch. Sometimes, she sighed while swaying with Emma in her arms, the most beautiful music comes from broken places that learned how to heal. That's when she saw him. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and the world contracted to that single moment of recognition. Zara froze, still holding Emma, her expression shifting from joy to uncertainty to something approaching defiance. But she didn't stop the music, didn't rush to turn it off or herd the children away or apologize for bringing life into his mausoleum. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, a gesture that said, "Yes, this is who I am. This is what I believe your children need. And I'm not ashamed." Jonathan couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The children, sensing the change in energy, turned to see their father standing in the doorway like a man who'd stumbled into the wrong life. Emma wiggled down from Zara's arms and approached him with cautious steps. She looked up at him with those two old eyes and signed something simple. "Daddy, dance." The words hit him like physical blows. When had Emma ever asked him to join anything? When had any of his children reached toward him instead of accepting his distance? Behind Emma, Ethan and Ellie watched with identical expressions of hopeful uncertainty. They wanted their father to say yes, but they'd learned not to expect it. Zara stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, waiting to see what kind of man he really was beneath the expensive suits and carefully maintained walls. The kitchen held its breath. Jonathan looked at his daughter's outstretched hand, at the trust and longing in her face, at the woman who had somehow reached his children in ways he'd convinced himself were impossible. The music continued, wrapping around them all like an invitation to step into something new and terrifying and absolutely necessary. He knelt down to Emma's level, his throat tight with years of swallowed words. "I don't know how," he whispered, though she couldn't hear the admission. But Zara could. She stepped forward slowly, giving him space to retreat if needed. Instead of speaking, she placed her hand on the kitchen island where the vibrations were strongest, showing him what his children had already learned, that music lived in more than ears, that connection transcended sound. "Feel this," she said softly, and her voice carried no judgment, only invitation. Jonathan pressed his palm to the marble, and for the first time in 3 years, felt his children's world pulse beneath his fingertips. The bass line thrummed through stone and bone, finding rhythm in his heart he'd thought grief had silenced forever. Emma took his other hand, her small fingers warm and certain. Ethan and Ellie flanked them, creating a circle of connection that had seemed impossible minutes before. Zara began to move again, slowly this time, showing rather than telling. The children followed, and gradually, awkwardly, beautifully, so did Jonathan. He looked ridiculous, he knew. A man in a $3,000 suit attempting to sway to music his children couldn't hear, guided by a woman he'd barely acknowledged that morning. But ridiculous had never felt so much like coming home. Emma beamed up at him, her smile worth every moment of discomfort. Ethan grabbed his tie, using it to pull himself closer. Ellie simply pressed against his leg, trusting in his presence for perhaps the first time in her short life. And Zara watched it all with tears threatening to spill, seeing not a rude millionaire but a father finally finding his way back to his children. The song ended, but none of them stopped moving. They had found something more precious than music, more necessary than sound. They had found each other. In the settling quiet, with only the soft hum of appliances and the whisper of evening settling over Greenwich, Jonathan looked across his children's heads to meet Zara's eyes. "Thank you," he mouthed, knowing she would understand. Her smile in return was radiant, transformative, full of promises neither of them dared name yet. But promises, like music, lived in more than words. They lived in the space between what was and what could be, in the courage to let walls crumble, in the faith that some broken things were meant to heal together. The kitchen would never be the same. Neither would any of them. Jonathan's hands trembled as he poured his third cup of coffee, the image from the night before playing on an endless loop in his mind. The way Zara had moved with his children, the way they had responded to her, it felt like witnessing something sacred that he had no right to see. He'd stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching Emma's face transform with pure joy as she felt the music through the floorboards, seeing Ethan's shy smile as he attempted the simple movements, witnessing Ellie's uninhibited laughter that he could see but not hear. When had he last seen them laugh? The question haunted him through a sleepless night spent pacing his study, trying to rationalize what he'd witnessed. It was just dancing. Children being children. Nothing more profound than a caregiver doing her job. Perhaps too well. "Mr. Reed." Zara's voice made him spin around, nearly dropping his mug. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding Emma's hand, the other two children peeking out from behind her legs like shy deer. He cleared his throat, scrambling for the cold authority that usually came so easily. "I trust you found everything you needed last night." "Yes, sir. The children ate well. We had a quiet evening." Quiet. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning he wasn't ready to unpack. He noticed how Emma stayed close to Zara's side, how all three children seemed more relaxed than he'd seen them in months. "I'll be working from the city office today," he said, already moving toward his briefcase. "I trust you can manage the children's routine." Emma let go of Zara's hand and approached him cautiously. She pointed to herself, then to him, then made a gesture he didn't understand. Hands moving in a pattern that clearly meant something important to her. Jonathan stared at his daughter's earnest face, feeling like a tourist in his own home. I don't." Emma's expression fell. She tried the gesture again, more slowly, her eyes pleading for understanding that he couldn't provide. "She's asking if you want to eat breakfast with them," Zara translated quietly. The simple request hit him like a physical blow. When had he last shared a meal with his children? When had he stopped trying to learn their language, the signs that could bridge the gap between his world and theirs? "I have an early meeting," he said, the lie bitter in his mouth. Emma's shoulders sagged. She nodded with the resignation of a child who had learned not to expect too much, then returned to Zara's side. "Perhaps another time," Zara said gently, but her eyes held something that looked like disappointment. Jonathan grabbed his briefcase and headed for the garage, but Emma's face followed him. The way her hope had crumbled. The way she'd looked at Zara for comfort when her own father couldn't give her what she needed. The Mercedes engine roared to life, drowning out thoughts he didn't want to think. He had work to do, deals to close, a company to run, real responsibilities that made sense, unlike the chaos of trying to parent children who lived in a world he couldn't enter. But as he drove down the winding Greenwich roads toward I-95, he couldn't shake the memory of last night, the way the room had felt alive with something he'd thought was lost forever. Joy, connection, family. Back in the kitchen, Zara helped the children prepare breakfast, but her mind was on the man who had just fled his own home. She'd seen that look before, The panic of someone confronted with their own walls, the fear of vulnerability disguised as urgency. Emma tugged on her sleeve and signed something that looked like a question. What did she ask? Zara said aloud, knowing the children could read her lips. Emma repeated the sign, then pointed toward where her father had disappeared. Ethan joined in, making the same gesture, his small face serious. They want to know if Daddy is angry with them, Ellie said, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of a child who had learned to speak despite never hearing her own words. Zara's heart clenched. She knelt to their level, making sure they could all see her face clearly. Your daddy isn't angry with you, she said, signing the words she knew. Sometimes grown-ups have big feelings that are hard to understand. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Emma shook her head, frustration clear in her expression. She made a series of signs that Zara couldn't follow, but the emotion was universal. The confusion of a child who sensed rejection but couldn't understand why. Tell you what, Zara said, an idea forming. After breakfast, we're going to make something special. Something that shows your daddy how much you love him, even when he's scared. The children perked up, intrigued. What are we making? Ellie asked, bouncing on her toes. Zara smiled, remembering her grandmother's wisdom about healing hearts through feeding them. We're going to cook his favorite meal and surprise him when he comes home. In his Manhattan office, Jonathan tried to lose himself in quarterly reports and acquisition strategies, but concentration eluded him. Every few minutes, his mind drifted to the morning scene. Emma's hopeful gesture, the hurt in her eyes when he'd rejected her invitation, the way Zara had stepped in to comfort his daughter when he couldn't. Shouldn't. Wouldn't. The distinction felt important, though he couldn't say why. His assistant knocked and entered. Mr. Reed. Your 2 p.m. canceled. Your calendar is clear until the board meeting at 4. Fine, he muttered, not looking up from papers he wasn't really reading. Sir. Is everything all right? You seem. Jonathan's head snapped up. I see what. Distracted, she finished carefully. Distracted. That was one way to put it. Haunted might be more accurate. By the sound of silence that wasn't silent. By children who spoke with their hands and hearts. By a woman who had somehow unlocked something in his house that he'd thought was permanently broken. He stood abruptly. Cancel the board meeting. Sir. Reschedule it. I'm going home. The drive back to Greenwich felt different this time. Not an escape but a return to something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As he pulled into his circular driveway, he noticed music drifting from the house. Not loud but present. Alive. He found them in the kitchen again, flour dusting every surface. 3 small figures standing on chairs around the marble island while Zara guided them through what looked like organized chaos. They were making pasta from scratch, their hands deep in dough, their faces bright with concentration and joy. Emma saw him first. Her eyes widened, and she signed something to the others. All 3 children froze, uncertainty replacing their previous animation. Don't stop, Jonathan heard himself say. I came home early. Zara looked surprised but not displeased. We're making your favorite, she said simply. The children wanted to surprise you. My favorite. Ethan found a cookbook with a page marked, Linguine à la vongole. She gestured to fresh clams soaking in a bowl. White wine waiting to be opened. Emma said you made it for their mother. The words hit him like a physical blow. Isabella had loved that dish, had learned to make it from his Italian grandmother during their brief, perfect courtship. After she died, he'd never been able to eat it again, and couldn't bear the memories it carried. How did his children know this? How did they remember something from before they were old enough to remember anything? "We don't have to," Zara said quickly, reading his expression. "If it's too difficult." "No." The word came out rougher than he intended. "No, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. The kitchen filled with life and laughter, his children happily creating something beautiful, a woman who somehow understood what his family needed. It was everything he'd convinced himself was impossible. Emma left her station and approached him, her hands messy with flour. She looked up at him with those two wise eyes and made a sign he recognized. Help. She wanted him to help. When had anyone last wanted his help with something that mattered? "I don't know how," he said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. Emma smiled, that radiant expression he'd almost forgotten she possessed, and took his hand, leading him to the counter. She pointed to the dough, then to her own hands working it, showing him the rhythm. Slowly, carefully, Jonathan placed his hands next to his daughter's. The dough was warm, alive beneath their fingers. Emma guided his movements, patient in the way children could be when they sensed something important was happening. Ethan and Ellie abandoned their own tasks to watch, their faces filled with wonder at seeing their father participate in their world for once. "Like this," Zara said softly, covering Jonathan's hands with hers to show him the proper technique. Her touch was warm, confident, grounding. For a moment, they were all connected. 4 pairs of hands working the same dough, creating something together. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. Then Emma said something in sign language, her hands moving in quick, excited gestures. "What did she say?" Jonathan asked. Zara hesitated. She said, you smell like home." The words shattered something inside him. All the walls he'd built, all the distance he'd maintained, all the ways he'd convinced himself that loving them from afar was protection rather than abandonment. It crumbled in the face of his daughter's simple truth. He was home. For the first time since Isabella's death, he was actually home. But instead of relief, panic rose in his throat. This was too much, too fast, too dangerous. Opening his heart meant risking it again, and he'd barely survived losing it once. "I should." He stepped back, flour still coating his hands. "I should let you finish." The light in Emma's eyes dimmed. She made another sign, a question he couldn't answer because he didn't know the language of his own children's hearts. She asked if she did something wrong. Zara translated quietly. "No," Jonathan said quickly. "No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong." But he was already backing toward the door, toward safety, toward the isolation that had become his refuge. He saw the confusion in their faces, felt Zara's gaze following him, but he couldn't stay. Couldn't risk the hope that was trying to take root in his chest. Some things were too broken to fix. Some silences were safer left undisturbed. As he reached the kitchen doorway, Emma's voice stopped him. Small, clear, carrying across the space between them like a prayer. "Daddy, please don't go." The words were spoken aloud, carefully pronounced, heartbreakingly hopeful. His daughter had used her voice, something she did rarely, something that took effort and courage, to ask him to stay. Jonathan's hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white. Behind him, he could hear the soft sounds of cooking resuming, Zara gently redirecting the children's attention, protecting them from witnessing their father's retreat. He wanted to turn around. I wanted to return to the warmth of that kitchen, to the connection that had felt as natural as breathing. But fear was stronger than want, and he'd spent 3 years learning to choose safety over everything else. even over love. Especially over love. He walked away, leaving flower handprints on his doorframe and fractures in 3 small hearts that were learning, once again, not to hope for too much from the man who was supposed to love them most. Behind him, the kitchen grew quiet except for the gentle sounds of Zara helping his children finish what they'd started. A meal made with love for a father who was too afraid to receive it. The aroma would fill the house later, carrying with it the promise of family dinners that might have been, of connection that could exist if only someone were brave enough to reach for it. But Jonathan had already proven he was many things: successful, wealthy, powerful. Brave wasn't one of them. Not yet. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the Reed mansion into darkness just as the nor'easter reached its full fury. Outside, winds howled like banshees against the colonial sturdy walls, and rain lashed the windows with supernatural intensity. Inside, 3 small children who lived in perpetual silence suddenly found themselves in a darkness that matched their world. Jonathan had been in his study, reviewing quarterly reports by lamplight when the power failed. His first instinct was irritation. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. His second was something he hadn't felt in years: concern for his children. The darkness was absolute, the kind that made even familiar spaces feel foreign and dangerous. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight and made his way toward the main house, guided by memory and the occasional flash of lightning that threw grotesque shadows across the walls. In the kitchen, Zara's maternal instincts had kicked in the moment the lights went out. She knew that for deaf children, losing sight meant losing their primary connection to the world. The darkness that might frighten hearing children would be absolutely terrifying for Emma, Ethan, and Ellie. "It's okay, babies," she whispered, though they couldn't hear her. Her voice was for herself, an anchor in the sudden chaos. She felt around the kitchen island until her fingers found the emergency candles Mrs. Patterson had shown her earlier. The soft glow of candlelight revealed 3 small faces pressed together on the kitchen floor, Emma's arms wrapped protectively around her siblings. Their eyes were wide with fear, but they weren't crying. They had learned early that tears brought no rescue in their silent world. Zara knelt beside them, her movements slow and deliberate so they could see her in the flickering light. She gathered all 3 into her arms, feeling their small bodies trembling against her. Emma's fingers clutched at her shirt with desperate strength. Through the kitchen doorway, Jonathan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness. He stopped short when he saw them, his children seeking comfort from a woman he barely knew, accepting solace he couldn't seem to provide. The sight hit him like a physical blow. "Are they hurt?" His voice was sharper than intended, fear disguised as authority. Zara looked up, noting how his beam wavered slightly. Even millionaires could be afraid of the dark, apparently. They're scared. The darkness, it's different for them. A massive crack of thunder shook the house, and all 3 children pressed closer to Zara. She could feel their heartbeats racing against her chest. "The generator?" Jonathan asked. "I heard it try to start, then stop. Probably flooded." Another flash of lightning, this one close enough to make the air smell of ozone. In its brief illumination, Jonathan saw something that stopped his breath. Zara had positioned herself between the children and the windows, her body a shield against whatever might come. It was an instinctive gesture, protective and self-sacrificing. When has anyone ever done that for his children? When had anyone ever done that for him? "We should move to the interior hall," he said, his business executive voice cracking slightly. "Away from the windows." But as he stepped forward, Emma looked up and saw her father approaching in the candlelight. Instead of reaching for him, she burrowed deeper into Zara's embrace. The rejection, unintentional but unmistakable, hit Jonathan like ice water. She doesn't mean. Zara began. Yes, she does. His voice was hollow. They all do. A tree branch crashed against the kitchen window, spider-webbing the glass but not breaking it. The children couldn't hear the impact, but they felt it. The vibration traveling through the floor, up their bodies, into their bones. Ethan began to cry, silent tears that broke Jonathan's heart more thoroughly than any scream could have. His son's mouth opened in distress, but no sound emerged, just the desperate movements of a child calling for help in a language his father had never learned to speak. "We need to get them calm," Zara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Fear spreads through touch when you can't hear reassurance." She began to rock gently, her movements rhythmic and soothing. Then, without thinking, she started to hum, a low, vibrating sound that the children could feel through her chest. An old spiritual her grandmother had sung, passed down through generations of women who knew that sometimes survival meant creating your own light in the darkness. The effect was immediate. Emma's grip loosened slightly. Ethan's tears slowed. Ellie, the youngest, actually nestled closer, seeking more of the comforting vibration. Jonathan watched, mesmerized. His children, who flinched when he entered a room, who avoided his touch, who looked through him as if he were glass, were melting into this woman's embrace like flowers turning toward the sun. "How do you know how to do that?" he asked quietly. "My foster mother used to hold me during storms. I was 8, terrified of thunder. She couldn't make the noise stop, but she could make me feel safe despite it." Foster mother. The words hung in the air, adding another layer to the woman he was beginning to realize he knew nothing about. Another branch hit the house, this time against the front door. The sound reverberated through the structure, and all 3 children looked toward the noise with expressions of pure terror. They might not hear it, but they felt everything. The house shaking, the vibrations of impact, the electricity of fear in the air. "The fireplace," Jonathan said suddenly. "In the family room. If we can get a fire going." Light and warmth, Zara nodded. Visual comfort. But when they tried to move, Emma clung to Zara and shook her head violently. She pointed to the windows, then to herself and her siblings, then made a cutting motion across her throat. The message was clear. Moving meant danger. "She thinks we're safer here," Jonathan realized. "She's trying to protect everyone," Zara said softly. "She always does." The simple statement hit Jonathan like a revelation. His 3-year-old daughter had assumed the role of family protector because no one else had stepped up to do it. She was carrying a burden no child should bear, especially not one who had already lost so much. He knelt beside them, his expensive suit collecting dust from the kitchen floor. This close, he could see details he usually missed, the way Ellie had their mother's delicate features, how Ethan's eyes held his own stubbornness, how Emma's small hands moved constantly, signing words he didn't understand. "What is she saying?" he asked. Zara watched Emma's hands carefully. "She's asking if the house is safe. If we're all going to be okay." Emma looked directly at her father then, her hands still moving in urgent patterns. Jonathan felt helpless, cut off from his own child by a barrier he had convinced himself was insurmountable. "Tell her." He began, then stopped. "Can you teach me?" "What?" "The words. How to tell her we're safe." What do you think Jonathan is truly asking for at this moment? Drop a comment and let us know your thoughts. Zara shifted slightly, freeing one hand while keeping the children close. "Put your hands like this," she said, guiding his fingers into the proper position. "This means safe. This is Daddy. And this, She moved his hands in a gentle, encompassing gesture. Means protect. Jonathan's hands were shaking. From adrenaline, from cold, from the overwhelming realization that he was about to communicate with his daughter for the first time in months. He looked at Emma and slowly, carefully, formed the signs. Safe. Daddy. Protect. Emma's eyes widened. She stared at his hands, then at his face, then back at his hands as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then, so quietly that only Zara heard it, she made a sound. Not a word, but a soft vocalization of pure joy. She reached for Jonathan's hands, guiding them to repeat the signs. Safe. Daddy. Protect. Each repetition seemed to build a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Ethan, seeing his sister's reaction, crawled closer to his father. He pointed to Jonathan, then to himself with a questioning look. He wants to know if you'll protect him too, Zara translated. Jonathan's throat closed up. When had he last held his son? When had any of them asked anything of him besides his absence? He reached for Ethan, who came willingly into his arms. The boy was so light, so fragile, but when he pressed his face against Jonathan's chest, the millionaire could feel his son's complete trust settling over him like a mantle. Ellie, not to be left out, wiggled free from Zara and climbed onto Jonathan's lap. 3 children who had learned to expect nothing from their father suddenly demanded everything. His attention, his presence, his love. The storm continued to rage outside, but something had shifted in the kitchen. The candlelight flickered across faces that were no longer strangers and family, employer and employee, but simply human beings sharing shelter from the tempest. The fire, Jonathan said, his voice rough with emotion. We should still try for the fire. Together, Zara said. It wasn't a question. They moved as a unit, Jonathan carrying Ellie, Zara guiding Emma and Ethan, all of them navigating the dark house by candlelight and touch. The family room felt cavernous in the shadows, but the stone fireplace promised warmth and light. Jonathan hadn't built a fire in years. His hands fumbled with newspaper and kindling while the children watched with rapt attention. Zara knelt beside him, her presence steadying rather than judgmental. Like this, she said, showing him how to create air pockets in the kindling. Fire needs to breathe. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. When had he last allowed himself to breathe? When had he last given his children room to breathe around him? The fire caught, small flames licking at the dry wood, growing stronger with each breath of air. The children clapped their hands, not because they heard the crackling, but because they could see the light pushing back the darkness. Emma stood and moved to the fireplace, her small hands extended toward the warmth. She looked back at her father and signed something quickly. What did she say? Zara's voice was soft. She said, "Thank you for the light." Jonathan felt tears he hadn't shed since the funeral burning behind his eyes. Such a simple thing. Fire and light and warmth. But to his daughter it was everything. Safety. Comfort. Love made visible. The storm reached its peak then, the house groaning under the assault of wind and rain. But in the family room, 5 people who had been strangers to each other that morning sat together in the firelight, sharing the most basic human need, the desire not to face the darkness alone. Jonathan looked at his children, really looked at them, and saw not the reminders of loss he had trained himself to see, but the possibilities of love he had been too afraid to embrace. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "when this is over, I want to learn more signs." Zara smiled. "They'd like that. And I want to know about you. About foster mothers and storms and how you learned to speak their language." "It's not their language," she corrected gently. "It's just another way of saying the same things we all need to say." Outside, the storm began its slow retreat, but inside the Reed mansion, something much more powerful had just begun. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the quiet spaces between words. Zara found herself in Jonathan's study at nearly midnight, drawn by the soft glow of lamplight under the door. She'd checked on the children 3 times. They slept deeply now, exhausted from their evening of discovery and connection. She knocked softly. "Mr. Reed." "I brought coffee." "Come in." His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Jonathan sat behind an antique desk, but his attention wasn't on the financial reports scattered before him. Instead, he held a small silver bracelet, turning it over in his fingers like a prayer bead. The study felt different in the lamplight. Less intimidating, more human. Family photos lined the shelves, most turned face down except one, a radiant woman with dark hair holding 3 tiny infants. "That's beautiful," Zara said, setting the coffee beside him and nodding toward the bracelet. It was Catherine's. Jonathan's thumb traced the delicate chain. "My wife. She wore it every day, said it brought her luck." He looked up, and Zara saw something raw in his expression. Didn't bring her enough, apparently. Zara settled into the chair across from his desk, uninvited but somehow welcome. "Tell me about her." "Why?" The question came out sharper than intended, a reflex born of years protecting his wounds. "Because your children ask about her. Not with words, but with their eyes. Emma traces letters on the window sometimes. Mama. She doesn't know I'm watching." Jonathan's hand stilled on the bracelet. "They were supposed to be twins. Catherine joked that we were getting a 2-for-1 deal." His mouth curved in what might have been a smile if it reached his eyes. Then at the 20-week ultrasound, surprise. Triplets. Catherine cried happy tears for an hour. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. The pregnancy was complicated from the start. Preeclampsia, bed rest, constant monitoring. But she was determined. Said our babies were fighters, just like her. "She sounds strong." "Stubborn," Jonathan corrected, but fondly. "She insisted on a natural birth despite the risks. When labor started at 32 weeks. He trailed off, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. 36 hours. That's how long she fought. The babies came first. So small, so fragile. Then complications. Hemorrhaging. The doctor said she was gone before they could even explain what went wrong." The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief that had nowhere to go. "I held them for the first time at her funeral," Jonathan continued. 3 pounds each, covered in wires and tubes. The NICU became our world for 3 months. That's where we learned about hearing loss, a side effect of the medications that saved their lives. Zara watched him struggle with words that had lived inside him for 3 years, poisoning him with their weight. "I used to talk to them constantly in those early days," he admitted. "Sang lullabies Catherine had picked out, read stories, described everything I saw. Then one day, a nurse gently explained that they couldn't hear me. That all my words were just noise. But not meaningless noise," Zara said softly. "Weren't they?" Jonathan turned from the window, his eyes bright with unshed tears. What's the point of bedtime stories if they can't hear them? What's the point of saying, "I love you," if it's just mouth movements? Zara stood, moving closer. "May I tell you something?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "My little brother Marcus was born when I was 12. My mother was 17, struggling with addiction, and my grandmother was raising us both." She paused, gathering strength from old pain. Marcus was born with cerebral palsy. Couldn't walk, couldn't speak clearly, needed help with everything. Jonathan listened, recognizing the careful way she constructed her words around tender spots. I was angry, Zara continued. Angry at my mother for leaving, angry at my grandmother for being tired all the time, angry at Marcus for needing so much. I thought love was supposed to be easy, natural. When it wasn't, I decided I wasn't good at it. What happened? One night when I was 15, Marcus had a seizure. Bad one. While we waited for the ambulance, I held his hand and sang some silly song from a commercial. When his eyes focused on me, he smiled. Not because he could hear the words, but because he could feel that I was there. Really there, not just going through the motions. She moved to one of the face-down photographs, gently turning it upright. It showed Jonathan and Catherine at what looked like their wedding, both laughing at something off camera. Love isn't about perfect communication, Mr. Reed. It's about showing up. Your children don't need to hear I love you. They need to feel it in how you see them, touch them, choose them every day. Jonathan stared at the photograph, seeing Catherine smile as if for the first time in years. I failed them. After she died, I just shut down. Hired people to do what I couldn't. Told myself I was providing for them, but really I was just avoiding them. Because it hurt too much. Because I was terrified. The admission came out like a confession. Terrified I'd lose them too. Terrified I wasn't enough. Catherine was the one who researched deaf education, learned sign language, and prepared for their needs. Without her, I felt completely inadequate. Zara reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos until she found what she was looking for. This is Marcus now. He's 23, works at a community center in Oakland, California. I have more friends than I do. The photo showed a young man in a wheelchair, surrounded by laughing children, his face bright with joy despite the speech device in his lap. He taught me that different doesn't mean less, Zara said. Your children communicate in beautiful ways, with their hands, their expressions, their whole bodies. Emma dances when she's happy. Ethan builds elaborate block towers when he's thinking. Ellie draws these incredible pictures that tell stories without words. I've missed all of that. Jonathan's voice was hollow. But you don't have to keep missing it. Zara moved to another photograph, this one showing the triplets as newborns. They're 3 years old, Mr. Reed. You haven't missed their childhood. You're standing at the beginning of it. Jonathan picked up Catherine's bracelet again, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried hope instead of despair. She would have loved tonight. Seeing them so happy, so alive. She would have loved seeing their father come back to them. I don't know how to be what they need. Neither do I, completely. But maybe we figure it out together. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jonathan really looked at her. Not as an employee or a stranger, but as someone who understood the weight of caring for precious, fragile things. Why? He asked. Why do you care so much about helping us? Zara was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I know what it feels like to grow up believing your parents chose everything else over you. I know what it feels like to be different and have the people who should love you most treat that difference like a burden. Your mother overdosed when I was 19. I spent years angry that she chose drugs over Marcus and me. But I realized later that she didn't choose drugs. She chose numbness because loving us hurt too much when she felt so broken herself. The parallel hung between them, unspoken but understood. I don't want Emma, Ethan, and Ellie to spend their lives wondering why their father couldn't choose them, Zara continued. And I don't want you to waste any more years punishing yourself for surviving when Catherine didn't. Jonathan set the bracelet down carefully, as if placing it on an altar. I dream about her sometimes. She's always disappointed in me for letting fear win. What would she say if she were here now? To stop being an idiot and go hug our children. Jonathan's smile was watery but real. She never had patience for self-pity. Smart woman. The smartest. He stood, moving toward the door, then stopped. Zara. Thank you. For tonight, for seeing them, really seeing them when I couldn't. Thank you for letting me stay. For letting me be part of this. As Jonathan headed upstairs to check on his sleeping children, Zara remained in the study, surrounded by the evidence of a life interrupted but not ended. The storm outside had cleared, leaving stars visible through the tall windows. She thought about Marcus, about her grandmother's worn hands teaching her to braid hair and bind wounds, about all the family she'd worked for who never quite came home. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something worth staying for. Have you ever had a moment when someone's story completely changed how you saw them? What happened when you realized you weren't alone in your struggles? Share your experiences. We'd love to hear how connection changed your perspective. Upstairs, Jonathan stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching 3 small chests rise and fall in perfect synchronization. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, full of love that didn't need words to be real. Emma stirred as if sensing his presence, and smiled in her sleep. Jonathan stepped into the room and, for the first time since Catherine died, whispered, "Daddy's here. Daddy's finally here." Outside, Greenwich settled into the peaceful quiet of a storm past, while inside the Reed mansion, a family began the slow, beautiful work of learning to be whole again. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Reed estate, casting golden patterns across the breakfast table where something miraculous had begun to unfold. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt peaceful, filled with the kind of communication that transcended sound. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, no longer hiding behind his newspaper or rushing off to Manhattan before dawn. Emma perched on his left, carefully spreading strawberry jam on toast while keeping one eye on her father's face, reading his expressions with the fluency of a child who had learned that love lived in the details others missed. Ethan bounced in his chair, his hands moving in animated signs as he told a story about the squirrel family living in the oak tree outside his bedroom window. His father watched intently, no longer pretending to understand but genuinely trying to learn the language his children had mastered. "Slow down, buddy," Jonathan signed, the movements still clumsy but earnest. "I'm still learning." Ellie giggled, a sound that vibrated through the table and straight into her father's heart, and repeated her brother's signs at a slower pace, appointed herself his patient teacher. Zara moved between the stove and the table with the grace of someone who had found her rhythm in this house, her movements a dance of efficiency and care. She wore a soft yellow dress that made the morning seem brighter, her hair pulled back in a way that framed her face like a halo. "More coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot because she had learned to read Jonathan's needs as intuitively as she read his children's. "Please." He watched her pour, noticing how her presence had transformed not just the children but the very atmosphere of the house. Plants that had been dying now bloomed on windowsills. Pictures of Catherine no longer gathered dust but stood alongside new memories. Drawings the triplets had made, photos of their recent adventures. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything in your life suddenly felt right? Tell us about it in the comments. The past 3 weeks had unfolded like pages in a book Jonathan had forgotten he wanted to read. It started small, Zara suggesting he join them for breakfast, then staying for bedtime stories told in sign language and acting out with exaggerated facial expressions that made the children dissolve into giggles. She had shown him how Emma preferred her sandwiches cut into triangles because the points helped her grip them better. How Ethan needed deep pressure hugs when he felt overwhelmed, his small body craving the sensory input that helped him regulate. How Ellie communicated her emotions through dance, her whole body becoming a language of joy, frustration, excitement, or fear. "Daddy," Emma signed, tugging on his sleeve to get his attention. "Zara taught us a new song today?" Jonathan looked questioningly at Zara, who smiled with the kind of mischief that had become familiar and beloved. "Not exactly a song," she said, setting down plates of fresh fruit cut into fun shapes. Stars for Emma, cars for Ethan, flowers for Ellie. More like a rhythm story. She moved to the kitchen counter where she had set up various items. Wooden spoons, metal bowls, rubber spatulas. The children's eyes lit up with recognition and anticipation. "We discovered that music isn't just about hearing," she explained to Jonathan. "It's about feeling, about patterns your body can sense and respond to." Emma scrambled down from her chair and ran to Zara's side, already reaching for her favorite instrument, a large mixing bowl that produced deep, resonant vibrations when tapped with a wooden spoon. "Show Daddy," Emma signed to Zara with the kind of excitement that comes from having something special to share. What followed was unlike anything Jonathan had ever experienced. Zara began tapping a rhythm on the counter. Simple, steady, like a heartbeat. Emma joined in with her bowl, the vibrations traveling through the floor, the table, the walls themselves. Ethan grabbed spoons and found his own rhythm on an overturned pot, his whole body swaying as he felt the beat rather than heard it. Ellie, ever the performer, began to dance, her movements perfectly synchronized with the rhythms her siblings created. She spun and leaped, her face radiant with joy, becoming the visual representation of the music they were making together. And Zara, she moved between them all like a conductor, adding her own beats, encouraging new rhythms, her voice providing melody that the children felt through her throat when they pressed close to her. Jonathan found himself leaning forward, mesmerized. This wasn't the careful, clinical world of his children's therapy sessions or the sterile interactions with previous caregivers who treated their deafness like a problem to be managed. This was joy. Pure, unfiltered, contagious joy. "Come," Zara said, holding out a rubber spatula to him. "There's always room for one more in our kitchen orchestra." For a moment, he hesitated. The old Jonathan, the man who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further loss, wanted to retreat to his study, to the familiar safety of isolation. But Emma was looking at him with such hope, such invitation, and Ethan had paused in his drumming to watch his father's response, and Ellie had stopped dancing to see if Daddy would join their magical world. Jonathan took the spatula. "What do I do?" "Feel," Zara said simply. "Close your eyes and feel the vibrations. Let your body tell you what rhythm wants to come out." He closed his eyes, suddenly self-conscious but determined not to disappoint his children. At first, there was nothing but the chaos of trying too hard. But gradually he began to sense the patterns they were creating. The steady heartbeat of Emma's bowl, the playful syncopation of Ethan's spoons, the swoosh and tap of his own spatula against the counter. When he opened his eyes, all three children were beaming at him with the kind of pride that comes from sharing something precious and having it understood. "Again," Ellie signed, clapping her hands. "Again, again." They played for another 20 minutes, creating rhythms that had no names but spoke a language older than words. Jonathan found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since Catherine's death. The sound surprised him so much he almost stopped, but Zara caught his eye and smiled with such warmth that he let the laughter continue. When they finally collapsed around the kitchen table, breathless and grinning, Emma crawled into Jonathan's lap and settled against his chest with the contentment of a child who felt truly seen by her father. "Daddy happy," she signed against his shirt, her small hands patting his heart. "Yes," he signed back, the movements becoming more natural each day. "Daddy is very happy." Ethan and Ellie crowded close, turning the chair into a pile of arms and legs and unconditional love. For a moment, Jonathan felt overwhelmed by the intensity of it. How much he had missed, how much time had been lost to grief and fear and the mistaken belief that protecting his heart meant protecting his children. Over their heads, he met Zara's eyes. She was cleaning up the improvised instruments, but her attention was fully on this moment, this breakthrough that she had facilitated without ever making it about herself. "Thank you," he mouthed to her. She smiled and shook her head slightly, as if to say this wasn't her gift to them, it was theirs to each other, and she had simply helped them unwrap it. Later, after the children had gone out to play in the garden where they could run and climb and experience the world through their bodies rather than their ears, Jonathan found Zara in the kitchen, preparing lunch. "I need to ask you something," he said, leaning against the counter where just an hour earlier they had created music together. She looked up from the sandwiches she was making, her expression open and attentive. "The dancing, the music, the way you connect with them. Where did you learn all this?" Zara's hands stilled on the bread. "I told you about Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor who was deaf. This is more than what a neighbor would teach." She was quiet for a long moment, and Jonathan sensed he was approaching something tender, something she had kept private. "I worked at a school for deaf children," she said finally, "in Oakland, California, for 2 years after college." "What happened? Why did you leave?" The pain that crossed her face was so raw he almost took back the question. "I fell in love," she said quietly. "With the work, with the kids, with one of the other teachers. David. He was deaf, and had been since birth. He taught me that being deaf wasn't a limitation. It was just a different way of experiencing the world." She resumed making sandwiches, but her movements were mechanical now, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "We were going to get married. We had plans to start our own program, a place where hearing and deaf families could learn together, where children like Emma and Ethan and Ellie could see themselves as complete, not broken." "What happened?" "He died." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, but Jonathan heard the ocean of grief beneath them. "Car accident. The other driver ran a red light, and David never heard the horn, never saw it coming from his blind spot." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "Zara, I'm so sorry. Everyone said it was because he was deaf. That if he could have heard. The insurance company used it to reduce the settlement. His family blamed me for not being in the car, for not being there to be his ears." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I started believing maybe they were right. Maybe loving someone means protecting them from their vulnerabilities, not celebrating their strengths." Understanding crashed over Jonathan like a wave. "So you left California." "I ran," she corrected. "I've been running ever since, taking temporary jobs, never staying long enough to invest in anything permanent again." They stood in silence, two people who had learned that love could be the source of the deepest pain, that caring meant risking loss so profound it could reshape the architecture of your soul. "But watching you with your children," Zara continued, "seeing how much they need you to celebrate who they are instead of grieving who they're not, it reminded me why David and I fell in love with this work in the first place." The children adore you. I adore them. She smiled through her tears. They're not broken, Jonathan. They're just speaking a language the world hasn't learned to hear yet. He stepped closer, drawn by an impulse he hadn't felt in 3 years. And you? What language do you speak? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Before she could answer, the kitchen door burst open and 3 small tornadoes blew in, grass-stained and glowing from their outdoor adventures. Hungry. Ethan signed dramatically, clutching his stomach. Eat now. Ellie added, bouncing on her toes. Emma, ever the diplomat, simply climbed onto a chair and waited patiently, but her eyes moved between her father and Zara with the kind of awareness that suggested she sensed something important had been happening in their absence. Lunch is ready, Zara announced, the vulnerable moment tucked away but not forgotten. As they gathered around the table, a family in all but name, Jonathan watched his children interact with the woman who had brought music back to their silent world. He saw how Emma leaned into Zara's side while eating, seeking the comfort of connection. How Ethan shared his favorite parts of his sandwich with her, the ultimate gesture of generosity from a 3-year-old. How Ellie performed little dances between bites, showing off for the adult who never failed to applaud her creativity. And he saw how naturally Zara had become the center around which they all orbited. Not because she demanded attention, but because she gave it so freely, so completely, that love had no choice but to grow in response. What does family mean to you? Is it about blood or about the bonds we choose to create? Share your thoughts below. Outside, the Connecticut autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson, a reminder that seasons changed, that what seemed permanent could transform into something entirely new and beautiful. Inside, in the warm heart of the kitchen, for people who had learned that home wasn't a place but a feeling, were discovering that sometimes the family you need finds you when you're brave enough to let down your walls and trust that love, despite its risks, was always worth the choice to stay. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and the kind of contentment that comes not from having everything, but from recognizing that what you have is enough. The morning after the charity gala arrived like a cold slap. Jonathan sat in his study, staring at the Hartford Courant Society page spread across his mahogany desk. There, in full color, was a photograph that made his blood run cold. Zara kneeling beside the triplets at the gala silent auction, all 4 of them signing animatedly while other guests watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. The caption read, "Local millionaire Jonathan Reed's unusual family dynamic raises eyebrows at the annual Greenwich Children's Foundation Gala." His phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Jonathan. His mother's voice cut through the study like a blade when he finally answered. "We need to talk." Elizabeth Reed arrived within the hour, her Bentley crunching up the gravel drive with the authority of old money and older prejudices. She swept into his study wearing disappointment like expensive perfume. "Sit down, Jonathan." "Mother, I don't have time for." "You have time for this." She placed the newspaper between them like evidence in a trial. "Do you see what people are saying? About you. About those children." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "What exactly are people saying?" "That you've lost perspective. That grief has clouded your judgment. That you're allowing the help to overstep boundaries in ways that reflect poorly on our family name." "Her name is Zara." "I don't care what her name is." Elizabeth's voice carried the sharp edge of generational authority. "She's made you a spectacle. Taking your disabled children out in public, encouraging them to perform their hand-waving for strangers. They were communicating. Something I should have been helping them do years ago." "Don't be naive." Elizabeth leaned forward. I've made inquiries. Did you know she's been in and out of foster care? That she has no formal education in special needs care? That she's never held a position for more than 18 months? Each word hit like a physical blow. Where did you? I protect this family, Jonathan. Always have. And right now you need to protect yourself. She pulled out a folder. Harmony Hills Academy in Massachusetts. They specialize in deaf children from prominent families. Discreet, professional, properly equipped. The folder landed on his desk with finality. Jonathan stared at it without opening it, knowing what it contained. Brochures, applications, a solution that would remove his children from his daily guilt and return his life to its comfortable numbness. They have openings for the fall, Elizabeth continued. The children would receive proper education, proper care, and you could focus on rebuilding your reputation. My reputation. The board is concerned, Jonathan. Reed Industries can't afford a CEO who appears unstable. Eccentric billionaire is one thing, but a man who lets the hired help dictate his children's care. She didn't need to finish. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A text from Charles Morrison, his oldest friend and board member. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow. Need to discuss your situation. The walls were closing in. Give me the folder, he said quietly. Elizabeth's smile was triumphant. You're making the right choice. For everyone. That evening, Zara was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Jonathan entered. The children were at the table, working on a puzzle with the focused intensity that came naturally to them. The scene looked so normal. So right. We need to talk, he said. Something in his tone made Emma look up sharply. Children who communicated through sight and sensation were expert readers of emotional weather, and storm clouds were gathering. Emma, take Ethan and Ellie to the playroom, Zara said in sign and voice. Emma shook her head, moving protectively closer to Zara. Now, Jonathan said, and the sharpness in his voice needed no translation. The children left reluctantly, Emma casting worried glances over her shoulder. When they were alone, Zara turned to face him. What's wrong? This. He threw the newspaper on the kitchen island. This is what's wrong. Zara stared at the photograph, at the caption, at the implication that their newfound happiness was somehow shameful. They made us look. She began. Like a spectacle. Like I'm some grief-stricken widower who's lost all judgment. Is that what you think? That I made you look foolish? I think you forgot your place. The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Zara stepped back as if she'd been slapped. My place. You're the help, Zara. You cook, you clean, you watch the children. You're not their mother. You're not their advocate. You're not part of this family. Each word was carefully chosen to hurt, to create distance, to rebuild walls that had been crumbling for months. And last night, in the garden, when you told me you low, last night was a mistake. Zara's face went very still. A mistake. I was grateful, emotional. I confused gratitude with something else. Something else. Her voice was barely a whisper. Is that what you call it when you held me? When you said you'd never felt so alive? I was drunk at the moment. It won't happen again. No, she said, straightening her shoulders with dignity that cut him deeper than anger would have. It won't. She moved toward the door, then stopped. What about Emma, Ethan, and Ellie? What about them? They're finally communicating with their father. finally feeling like they belong somewhere. Are you going to throw that away too? They'll be fine. Children adapt. Will they? Or will they just learn what you learned, that love is temporary, that connection is dangerous, that it's safer to feel nothing than risk everything? Her words hit their target with surgical precision. Jonathan's face went white. Don't, he said quietly. Don't what? Don't tell you the truth? Don't point out that you're about to make the same choice your father made with you. Get out. Jonathan. Get out of my house. Pack your things. I want you gone by morning. Zara stared at him for a long moment, tears threatening but refusing to fall. You know what's really sad? It's not that you're sending me away. It's that you actually believe you're protecting them. She walked to the door, then turned back one last time. When Emma asks me why I'm leaving, and she will ask because she notices everything, what should I tell her? That Daddy decided love was too scary? That feeling of safety was just pretend? Tell her whatever you want. It doesn't matter. She won't remember you in 6 months. You're wrong. Zara's voice was steady now, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo through the pristine kitchen. She'll remember. They all will. Children who've learned that adults disappear don't forget. They just stop believing that anyone will stay. She left him standing alone in the kitchen where it had all begun, surrounded by the silence he'd chosen over the sound of his own heart beating. Upstairs, 3 small faces pressed against a window, watching their world crumble again, understanding in the way that children do that the grown-ups had forgotten how to fight for what mattered most. Have you ever pushed away someone you loved because you were afraid of losing them? Tell us about a time when fear made your decisions for you. The house settled into its familiar emptiness, but now it felt different. Not peaceful but hollow. Jonathan poured himself a drink and sat in the kitchen where Zara had taught his children to dance, where she'd made him remember what it felt like to be alive. Outside, her silhouette moved past the windows as she packed her single suitcase, taking nothing that wasn't hers except the hearts she'd accidentally collected along the way. By morning she would be gone, and the Reed family would be safe again. Safe from love, safe from risk, safe from the terrifying possibility that broken things could actually heal. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of the most devastating day in a house that thought it had already seen its worst. The grandfather clock in Jonathan's study chimed midnight, its resonant notes echoing through a house that had never felt more empty. He sat in his leather chair, the same one where he'd made billion-dollar decisions with unwavering confidence. But tonight he couldn't even decide whether to turn on the lamp. The darkness felt appropriate. It matched the hollowness in his chest, the weight of Zara's words still reverberating like aftershocks. You're so afraid of losing them that you've already lost them. On his desk lay the resignation letter she'd left. Crisp, professional, devastating in its simplicity. Effective immediately. Best interests of the children. Grateful for the opportunity. No mention of the dance lessons, the laughter that had returned to these walls, the way Emma had started running to him instead of hiding. No mention of how, for 3 precious weeks, this house had felt like a home again. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother in her Nantucket estate. Darling, I heard about the unfortunate situation with the help. I have excellent references for proper nannies. Children need structure, not sentiment. Structure, not sentiment. The Reed family motto, passed down like a genetic defect. Through the study window, he could see the guest house where Zara had spent her last night. Dark now, empty. She'd left at dawn while the children slept, sparing them another goodbye they wouldn't understand. Jonathan's hands trembled as he picked up the crystal tumbler of bourbon he'd been nursing for hours. The amber liquid caught the moonlight, reminding him of Zara's eyes when she'd looked at him in the kitchen. Not with judgment, but with something far worse. Disappointment. You have 3 miracles living under your roof, and you treat them like obligations. The words cut deeper now in the silence. Because she was right. He'd been so busy protecting himself from more loss that he'd forgotten how to recognize what he still had. A soft vibration through the floorboards made him look up. Footsteps. Small ones. Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn teddy bear, her dark curls wild from sleep. She stood there in her pink pajamas, studying him with those ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. She approached slowly, the way she did when she sensed strong emotions. Children, deaf or hearing, had radar for adult pain. She climbed onto his lap without invitation, settling against his chest with the simple trust that shattered what remained of his defenses. Her small hand found his face, fingers tracing the wetness he hadn't realized was there. She looked concerned, tilting her head in that way that meant she was trying to understand something complex. Then she did something that broke him completely. She pressed her ear to his chest, feeling for his heartbeat the way Zara had taught her to feel for rhythm in music. Finding it, she began to pat his chest in the same steady tempo, her way of saying, "I hear you, Daddy. I hear you." "She's gone, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Miss Zara is gone, and it's my fault." Emma pulled back and looked at him seriously. Then she shook her head firmly, the universal gesture that needed no translation. "No." She scrambled down from his lap and tugged on his hand, trying to pull him from the chair. When he didn't move, she stomped her little foot and pointed toward the door with an expression of pure determination that reminded him exactly of her mother. "Emma, it's late. You should be sleeping." But she wasn't giving up. She ran to his desk, grabbed a pen with both hands, and dragged it to a piece of paper. Her writing was still shaky, letters reversed and uneven, but the message was clear. Zara Kitchen. Jonathan stared at the paper. "Sweetheart, she's not in the kitchen. She's gone. She left because..." Her words hit their target with surgical precision. Jonathan's face went white. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what? Don't tell you the truth? Don't point out that you're about to make the same choice your father made with you. Get out. Jonathan. Get out of my house. Pack your things. I want you gone by morning." Zara stared at him for a long moment, tears threatening but refusing to fall. "You know what's really sad? It's not that you're sending me away. It's that you actually believe you're protecting them." She walked to the door, then turned back one last time. "When Emma asks me why I'm leaving, and she will ask because she notices everything, what should I tell her? That Daddy decided love was too scary? That feeling of safety was just pretend? Tell her whatever you want. It doesn't matter. She won't remember you in 6 months. You're wrong." Zara's voice was steady now, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo through the pristine kitchen. "She'll remember. They all will. Children who've learned that adults disappear don't forget. They just stop believing that anyone will stay." She left him standing alone in the kitchen where it had all begun, surrounded by the silence he'd chosen over the sound of his own heart beating. Upstairs, 3 small faces pressed against a window, watching their world crumble again, understanding in the way that children do that the grown-ups had forgotten how to fight for what mattered most. Have you ever pushed away someone you loved because you were afraid of losing them? Tell us about a time when fear made your decisions for you. The house settled into its familiar emptiness, But now it felt different. Not peaceful but hollow. Jonathan poured himself a drink and sat in the kitchen where Zara had taught his children to dance, where she'd made him remember what it felt like to be alive. Outside, her silhouette moved past the windows as she packed her single suitcase, taking nothing that wasn't hers except the hearts she'd accidentally collected along the way. By morning, she would be gone, and the Reed family would be safe again. Safe from love, safe from risk, safe from the terrifying possibility that broken things could actually heal. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of the most devastating day in a house that thought it had already seen its worst. The grandfather clock in Jonathan's study chimed midnight, its resonant notes echoing through a house that had never felt more empty. He sat in his leather chair, the same one where he'd made billion-dollar decisions with unwavering confidence. But tonight he couldn't even decide whether to turn on the lamp. The darkness felt appropriate. It matched the hollowness in his chest, the weight of Zara's words still reverberating like aftershocks. You're so afraid of losing them that you've already lost them. On his desk lay the resignation letter she'd left. Crisp, professional, devastating in its simplicity. Effective immediately. Best interests of the children. Grateful for the opportunity. No mention of the dance lessons, the laughter that had returned to these walls, the way Emma had started running to him instead of hiding. No mention of how, for 3 precious weeks, this house had felt like a home again. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother in her Nantucket estate. Darling, I heard about the unfortunate situation with the help. I have excellent references for proper nannies. Children need structure, not sentiment. Structure, not sentiment. The Reed family motto, passed down like a genetic defect. Through the study window, he could see the guest house where Zara had spent her last night. Dark now, empty. She'd left at dawn while the children slept, sparing them another goodbye they wouldn't understand. Jonathan's hands trembled as he picked up the crystal tumbler of bourbon he'd been nursing for hours. The amber liquid caught the moonlight, reminding him of Zara's eyes when she'd looked at him in the kitchen. Not with judgment, but with something far worse. Disappointment. You have 3 miracles living under your roof, and you treat them like obligations. The words cut deeper now in the silence. Because she was right. He'd been so busy protecting himself from more loss that he'd forgotten how to recognize what he still had. A soft vibration through the floorboards made him look up. Footsteps. Small ones. Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn teddy bear, her dark curls wild from sleep. She stood there in her pink pajamas, studying him with those ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. She approached slowly, the way she did when she sensed strong emotions. Children, deaf or hearing, had radar for adult pain. She climbed onto his lap without invitation, settling against his chest with the simple trust that shattered what remained of his defenses. Her small hand found his face, fingers tracing the wetness he hadn't realized was there. She looked concerned, tilting her head in that way that meant she was trying to understand something complex. Then she did something that broke him completely. She pressed her ear to his chest, feeling for his heartbeat the way Zara had taught her to feel for rhythm in music. Finding it, she began to pat his chest in the same steady tempo, her way of saying, "I hear you, Daddy. I hear you." "She's gone, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Miss Zara is gone, and it's my fault." Emma pulled back and looked at him seriously. Then she shook her head firmly, the universal gesture that needed no translation. "No." She scrambled down from his lap and tugged on his hand, trying to pull him from the chair. When he didn't move, she stomped her little foot and pointed toward the door with an expression of pure determination that reminded him exactly of her mother. "Emma, it's late. You should be sleeping." But she wasn't giving up. She ran to his desk, grabbed a pen with both hands, and dragged it to a piece of paper. Her writing was still shaky, letters reversed and uneven, but the message was clear. Zara Kitchen. Jonathan stared at the paper. Sweetheart, she's not in the kitchen. She's gone. She left because. Her words hit their target with surgical precision. Jonathan's face went white. Don't, he said quietly. Don't what? Don't tell you the truth? Don't point out that you're about to make the same choice your father made with you. Get out. Jonathan. Get out of my house. Pack your things. I want you gone by morning. Zara stared at him for a long moment, tears threatening but refusing to fall. You know what's really sad? It's not that you're sending me away. It's that you actually believe you're protecting them. She walked to the door, then turned back one last time. When Emma asks me why I'm leaving, and she will ask because she notices everything, what should I tell her? That Daddy decided love was too scary? That feeling of safety was just pretend? Tell her whatever you want. It doesn't matter. She won't remember you in 6 months. You're wrong. Zara's voice was steady now, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo through the pristine kitchen. She'll remember. They all will. Children who've learned that adults disappear don't forget. They just stop believing that anyone will stay. She left him standing alone in the kitchen where it had all begun, surrounded by the silence he'd chosen over the sound of his own heart beating. Upstairs, 3 small faces pressed against a window, watching their world crumble again, understanding in the way that children do that the grown-ups had forgotten how to fight for what mattered most. Have you ever pushed away someone you loved because you were afraid of losing them? Tell us about a time when fear made your decisions for you. The house settled into its familiar emptiness, but now it felt different. Not peaceful but hollow. Jonathan poured himself a drink and sat in the kitchen where Zara had taught his children to dance, where she'd made him remember what it felt like to be alive. Outside, her silhouette moved past the windows as she packed her single suitcase, taking nothing that wasn't hers except the hearts she'd accidentally collected along the way. By morning, she would be gone, and the Reed family would be safe again. Safe from love, safe from risk, safe from the terrifying possibility that broken things could actually heal. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of the most devastating day in a house that thought it had already seen its worst. The grandfather clock in Jonathan's study chimed midnight, its resonant notes echoing through a house that had never felt more empty. He sat in his leather chair, the same one where he'd made billion-dollar decisions with unwavering confidence. But tonight he couldn't even decide whether to turn on the lamp. The darkness felt appropriate. It matched the hollowness in his chest, the weight of Zara's words still reverberating like aftershocks. You're so afraid of losing them that you've already lost them. On his desk lay the resignation letter she'd left. Crisp, professional, devastating in its simplicity. Effective immediately. Best interests of the children. Grateful for the opportunity. No mention of the dance lessons, the laughter that had returned to these walls, the way Emma had started running to him instead of hiding. No mention of how, for 3 precious weeks, this house had felt like a home again. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother in her Nantucket estate. Darling, I heard about the unfortunate situation with the help. I have excellent references for proper nannies. Children need structure, not sentiment. Structure, not sentiment. The Reed family motto, passed down like a genetic defect. Through the study window, he could see the guest house where Zara had spent her last night. Dark now, empty. She'd left at dawn while the children slept, sparing them another goodbye they wouldn't understand. Jonathan's hands trembled as he picked up the crystal tumbler of bourbon he'd been nursing for hours. The amber liquid caught the moonlight, reminding him of Zara's eyes when she'd looked at him in the kitchen. Not with judgment, but with something far worse. Disappointment. You have 3 miracles living under your roof, and you treat them like obligations. The words cut deeper now in the silence. Because she was right. He'd been so busy protecting himself from more loss that he'd forgotten how to recognize what he still had. A soft vibration through the floorboards made him look up. Footsteps. Small ones. Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn teddy bear, her dark curls wild from sleep. She stood there in her pink pajamas, studying him with those ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. She approached slowly, the way she did when she sensed strong emotions. Children, deaf or hearing, had radar for adult pain. She climbed onto his lap without invitation, settling against his chest with the simple trust that shattered what remained of his defenses. Her small hand found his face, fingers tracing the wetness he hadn't realized was there. She looked concerned, tilting her head in that way that meant she was trying to understand something complex. Then she did something that broke him completely. She pressed her ear to his chest, feeling for his heartbeat the way Zara had taught her to feel for rhythm in music. Finding it, she began to pat his chest in the same steady tempo, her way of saying, "I hear you, Daddy. I hear you." "She's gone, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Miss Zara is gone, and it's my fault." Emma pulled back and looked at him seriously. Then she shook her head firmly, the universal gesture that needed no translation. "No." She scrambled down from his lap and tugged on his hand, trying to pull him from the chair. When he didn't move, she stomped her little foot and pointed toward the door with an expression of pure determination that reminded him exactly of her mother. "Emma, it's late. You should be sleeping." But she wasn't giving up. She ran to his desk, grabbed a pen with both hands, and dragged it to a piece of paper. Her writing was still shaky, letters reversed and uneven, but the message was clear. Zara Kitchen. Jonathan stared at the paper. "Sweetheart, she's not in the kitchen. She's gone. She left because..." Emma shook her head again, more vigorously. She pointed to the paper, then to the kitchen, then back to him. Her meaning was unmistakable. "Go to the kitchen. Now." "Emma." She did something she'd never done before. She grabbed his hand with both of hers and looked directly into his eyes, not the casual glance of childhood, but the soul-deep stare of someone trying to communicate something vital. Then she touched her heart, pointed to the kitchen, and back to her heart. The heart is in the kitchen. Jonathan felt something shift inside his chest, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. His daughter, his miraculous, perceptive daughter, was trying to tell him something crucial. And for once in his life, he was going to listen. He stood, Emma still clinging to his hand, and let her lead him through the dark hallways toward the kitchen. Each step felt like walking through water, reality bending around the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too late. The kitchen was dark, but moonlight streamed through the large windows, casting everything in silver. Empty counters, clean sink, no sign of the warmth and laughter that had filled this space for weeks. Emma released his hand and ran to the spot where she'd danced with Zara that first day, the place where everything had changed. She looked back at him expectantly, then began to move her body the way Zara had taught her. Not hearing the music, but feeling it in the floorboards, the air currents, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. As she danced, Jonathan saw it, the piece of paper tucked under the fruit bowl. His hands shook as he unfolded it. "Jonathan, I couldn't leave without saying what I should have said in the kitchen. You're not broken. You're just scared." But love isn't about perfect communication or having all the answers. It's about showing up, trying, failing, and trying again. Your children don't need you to fix everything. They just need you to be present for everything. The dance isn't about hearing the music. It's about feeling the rhythm of each other's hearts. They've been dancing for you all along. You just have to join them. Z. P.S. Check the recipe box by the window. Some things are too important for resignation letters. With trembling hands, Jonathan opened the old wooden recipe box that had belonged to his late wife. Inside, beneath her handwritten cards for chocolate chip cookies and Sunday roasts, was a thick envelope addressed simply, "For when you're ready." Inside were dozens of photographs. Candid shots Zara must have taken over the past weeks. Emma teaches Ethan to fold napkins. Ellie giggled silently as she chased soap bubbles. All three children asleep in a pile on the living room floor after story time. And in the corner of several photos, barely visible, was Jonathan himself, watching from doorways, almost smiling, looking like a man falling back in love with his own life. At the bottom of the envelope was a single photograph that made his knees weak. It was him, captured through the kitchen window, the moment he'd first seen Zara dancing with his children. But it wasn't his face in the frame that mattered. It was his expression. Pure wonder. Complete love. A father seeing his children truly happy for the first time in their lives. On the back, in Zara's careful handwriting, "This is who you really are. This is the man they've been waiting for." Emma had stopped dancing and was watching him intently. When she saw the photos, her face lit up with recognition and something else. Hope. She pointed to herself, then to the pictures, then to him, her meaning clear. "We're a family. This is proof." Jonathan sank into one of the kitchen chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd almost thrown away. Not just Zara, though losing her felt like losing the son, but the chance to be the father his children deserved. The opportunity to build something real from the ashes of his grief. Emma climbed onto his lap again and nestled against him, her small body warm and solid and completely trusting. She pulled one of the photos from his hand, the one of all three children laughing, and held it against her chest, then against his. This is what matters. This is what's real. For the first time since his wife's death, Jonathan let himself cry. Not the bitter tears of self-pity, but the cleansing grief of a man finally ready to heal. Emma patted his shoulder gently, her way of saying, "It's okay, Daddy. I'm here." When the tears slowed, he looked down at his daughter, really looked at her, the way he should have been doing all along. Her eyes held patience, forgiveness, and an invitation to start over. He touched her cheek gently and mouthed, "I love you." She smiled, that radiant smile that could light up the whole house, and signed back, "I love you too, Daddy." But then she did something that nearly broke him with its simple wisdom. She pointed to the empty chair where Zara used to sit for their evening meals, then looked at him with a question in her eyes. What about Zara? What about bringing her home? Jonathan looked at the photographs scattered across the kitchen table, evidence of joy he'd been too afraid to fully embrace. He thought about Zara's words, her patience, her refusal to give up on any of them even when they gave up on themselves. He thought about Martha's Vineyard, where she'd mentioned growing up, about the way she'd described the lighthouse there, how it guided ships home through the storm. Emma was still watching him, waiting for an answer to her unspoken question. What do you think? Is it ever too late to fight for love? Share what your heart tells you below. Jonathan stood, Emma still in his arms, and walked to the window where morning light was just beginning to touch the edges of the sky. Somewhere out there was the woman who had taught his family how to dance again. the woman who had seen past his walls to the father he could still become. He looked down at Emma, whose expression was full of 3-year-old determination and ancient wisdom. "You're right, sweetheart," he whispered. "Some dances are worth fighting for." Emma clapped her hands silently, her whole body radiating joy. She pointed toward the door, then made the sign for go with such enthusiasm that her teddy bear fell to the floor. Jonathan smiled, the first real smile he'd felt in years. "Yes, baby girl. We're going to bring her home." As he carried Emma back upstairs to wake her siblings, he felt something he'd forgotten was possible. Hope, the kind that demanded action, required courage, and promised that sometimes the most important journeys began with admitting you'd lost your way. The sun was rising over Greenwich, painting the sky in shades of possibility. And Jonathan Reed, for the first time since becoming a father, was ready to dance. The kitchen that had once been a sterile monument to unused perfection now hummed with life. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, small handprints marked the lower cabinets, and the marble island bore the honorable scars of countless meals shared in laughter and love. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching his transformed world with wonder that still felt new each morning. Zara moved between the stove and counter with the graceful efficiency of someone completely at home. Her hair caught up in the colorful scarf Emma had insisted she wear. The triplets sat at their small table, an addition Jonathan had surprised them with last month, working on their morning art projects. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was full. Emma looked up and caught sight of her father, her face breaking into the radiant smile that had become his daily sunrise. She patted the empty chair beside her, their morning ritual now, and Jonathan's heart swelled as it did every time. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, settling beside her and automatically signing the words his hands had learned to speak. "Good morning, Daddy," Emma signed back, then pointed to her drawing. It was their family. 5 figures holding hands in front of a house that looked remarkably like their own, but with one crucial difference. The windows were filled with warm yellow light. Ethan abandoned his blocks and climbed onto Jonathan's lap, a privilege that still amazed the man who had once feared his own touch might break something precious. The little boy pointed to the pancakes Zara was making, then rubbed his stomach with theatrical hunger. "Patience, little man." Jonathan laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "Good things come to those who wait." He's been saying that all morning, Ellie signed with 3-year-old exasperation, making Zara laugh from across the kitchen. The sound of her laughter still had the power to stop Jonathan's breath. 6 months, and he was still discovering new ways she made their house feel like a home. "Someone's eager for Grammy's pancakes," Zara said, flipping a perfect golden circle. She had started calling herself Grammy after Emma had tried to pronounce Zara, and it had come out sounding like Gamma, which had evolved into Grammy, which had stuck because it felt right in ways that went deeper than pronunciation. "Tell her about the surprise," Emma signed to her father, bouncing with barely contained excitement. Jonathan's chest tightened with nervous anticipation. They had practiced this moment, planned it, but now that it was here, his hands felt clumsy with the weight of everything it meant. "Zara," he said, his voice carrying an odd formality that made her turn from the stove, eyebrows raised in question. The children giggled. They knew what was coming. "The children and I have been working on something. For you." Zara wiped her hands on her apron, the same one Emma had picked out for her. Bright blue with sunflowers. Working on what? Instead of answering, Jonathan nodded to the triplets, who immediately scrambled from their seats and positioned themselves in front of the kitchen island, faces serious with concentration. Then, together they began to move. It wasn't the chaotic, joyful dancing Zara had taught them 6 months ago. This was different. planned, purposeful, beautiful. Their small hands moved in perfect synchronization, telling a story in the language they all now shared. Once upon a time, their hands said, "There was a sad house with a sad daddy and 3 sad children." Jonathan's throat tightened as he watched his children perform the story they had insisted on telling. The daddy forgot how to smile, Emma's hands continued, her expression appropriately sorrowful, and the children forgot how to feel safe. Ethan stepped forward, his signs slower but determined. Then an angel came. She had kind hands and a big heart. She taught us that love sounds like laughter, Ellie added, and feels like hugs, and looks like someone staying. Zara's hand flew to her mouth, tears already blurring her vision. She taught the daddy how to see us, all 3 signed together, and taught us how to trust again. Jonathan stood, his own hands joining theirs. She taught a broken family how to be whole. The final movement brought all 4 of them together, hands intertwined, signing in unison. "Will you stay forever and be our real family?" The kitchen fell into the kind of silence that isn't empty but full to overflowing. Zara stood frozen, pancake spatula still in her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We know," Jonathan said, his voice rough with emotion, "that you came here as our employee, but somewhere along the way you became our everything. These children, they don't just love you, Zara. They need you. And so do I." He stepped closer, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes that had taken months to trust her with. "I know I can't give you back the family you lost," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I can't undo the years of other people making you feel like you don't belong anywhere. But if you'll have us, if you'll stay, we'd like to be your family too." "Say yes," Emma signed urgently, tugging on Zara's apron. "Please say yes." The spatula clattered to the floor as Zara sank to her knees, opening her arms to gather all 3 children against her heart. Over their heads, she looked at Jonathan with eyes that held 6 months of growing love, years of hidden longing, and a future full of possibility. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, singing as she spoke. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The kitchen erupted in chaos, the good kind. Children shrieked with joy only they could make, small arms wrapped around necks, and Jonathan found himself pulling all of them into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he was looking for. "I love you," he murmured against Zara's hair, words he'd been afraid to say, afraid she couldn't feel the same way about a man who had been so lost, so broken, so wrong about so many things. "I love you too," she whispered back. "All of you. More than I ever thought possible." Emma pulled back, studying both adults with the seriousness of a child who had learned to read hearts instead of voices. Then she grinned and began clapping her hands, not making sound, but creating the rhythm of celebration, the beat of joy that her siblings immediately joined. Soon all 5 of them were clapping, hands moving in patterns that spoke of happiness too big for words, whether spoken or signed. The kitchen filled with the music of a family finding itself, imperfect and beautiful and finally whole. Later, after the pancakes had been eaten, slightly burned from the excitement, after the triplets had been dressed for their playdate with the Parker children down the street, deaf twins who had become Emma, Ethan, and Ellie's first real friends. After the morning chaos had settled into the comfortable rhythm of their new normal, Jonathan and Zara found themselves alone in the kitchen where everything had changed. "I have something else," Jonathan said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Zara's breath caught. "Jonathan." "It's not what you think," he said quickly, then paused. "Well, it is, but not yet. Not until you're ready. This is something else." He opened the box to reveal not a diamond ring, but a delicate gold locket, heart-shaped and engraved with 4 small handprints and 1 larger one. The children wanted you to have something that showed you belong to us and us to you. Open it. Inside, nestled against velvet, was a photo none of them remembered taking. A candid shot from last month when they had all fallen asleep together on the living room couch during movie night, a tangle of arms and legs and pure contentment. "We're not a conventional family," Jonathan said as he fastened the locket around her neck. "We never will be. But we're ours, and we're real, and we're forever if you want us to be." Zara touched the locket, feeling its weight settle against her heart like an anchor, like a promise, like coming home. "Forever sounds perfect," she said, turning in his arms to face the man who had learned to love not despite the silence, but because of all the beautiful ways it could be filled. Outside, Greenwich basked in autumn sunshine that painted the world gold and amber. Inside, in a kitchen that had learned the difference between empty and quiet, between alone and peaceful, between a house and a home, a family wrote its own happy ending in the language of the heart. What does true family mean to you? Is it the people you're born with, or the people who choose to stay? We'd love to hear your thoughts on what makes a family complete. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon, its sound traveling through rooms that had learned to hold joy instead of echoes. In the kitchen, 5 hearts beat in harmony that needed no translation, creating a song of belonging that would play on, note by perfect note, for all the years to come. And in that harmony, in that choice to stay, to love, to become the family none of them had started as but all of them had needed to be, they found what they had each been searching for without knowing how to name it. Home. Not a place, but a feeling. Not perfection, but love. Not the family they had planned, but the family they had chosen and who had chosen them back. Forever and always in the language of the heart. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.